Welcome everyone to the Yogic Studies podcast. This is episode 35. I'm your host, Seth Powell, and today we are joined by Dr. Arti Dhand, who is Associate Professor at the University of Toronto in the Department for the Study of Religion. Arti will be teaching an upcoming course, as you know, at Yogic Studies on the Mahābhārata. She's the host of the Mahabharata Podcast, and we're really excited and honored to have her today to discuss all things Mahābhārata. So Arti, warm welcome to Yogic Studies.
Thank you, Seth. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, it's a great pleasure to have you here. You know, we don't know each other really very well. I actually first discovered your work through your podcast, the Mahabharata Podcast. And then I also learned that a former student of yours is actually one of our instructors. That's Dr. Raj Bolkaran. Is that right? Was he one of your students?
Absolutely, the ubiquitous Raj.
Yes.
I have known Raj for a long, long time. Going on 18 years now.
Wow.
So he was a student in my class. I watched him go from undergraduate to all the way through his graduate work, and here he is now doing some pretty extraordinary things on his own podcast and research as an independent scholar. So marvelous stuff.
Yeah, well, Dr. Raj is a great friend of the show, as we say, and a favorite instructor in the yogic studies community. And as you said, doing really exciting and wonderful things kind of in similar spaces as I'm operating in within academic circles, but also pushing the boundaries outside of academia online and using podcasts and educational platforms. You yourself also launched a podcast. So let's start there. Tell us a little bit about the Mahābhārata podcast. How did that come about for you? What was the idea to put that out there, and kind of what's that experience been like for you?
Yeah, thanks. Well, if I could roll the tape back about 5 years and say, okay, 5 years from now, you're going to be doing a podcast, I would never have imagined it. I'm a techno dunce. I know absolutely nothing about technology. I'm terribly bad at it. And so the idea that somehow or the other I would have achieved enough command of this medium to be able to actually talk to people is extraordinary to me. Why did it happen? How did it happen? This is really a pandemic baby. When I started out, or when the pandemic hit, I was doing a graduate class on the Mahābhārata, and we stopped halfway. All of a sudden, the great lively conversations we were having, all of them disappeared, and then all of us are in this vacuum. Just somehow to deal with the insanity of it all and the isolation, I started thinking about how to reach out to my students, and eventually that morphed into the podcast. So it's been really fun. It took some getting used to, that's for sure. It's been really fun, but I've learned a lot. It's been a lot of work, but my perspective on the Mahābhārata has changed. It's taught me a lot, the process.
Yeah, this podcast was also a pandemic baby, to use your phrase there. I think we started in May 2020, so maybe around the same time as your podcast, perhaps. It was something I had thought about. You know, you kind of have an idea, a seed of something like that for a while, but you resist it for a long time, I think, in many cases. And then at a certain point you think, well, time seems right to put that out there. And it's been quite a journey of learning how to do this and what, the vision of it is and how it can grow. I was going back and listening to your podcast, and the very first episode, you actually tell a bit of a story about the genesis of it, and you were telling this story about how a friend had sent you this text message when Game of Thrones was coming to an end, a
Right.
modern Western epic, if you will. Tell us a little bit about that and how that might relate to the Mahābhārata.
Well, it's exactly like it went exactly like that. So the Game of Thrones, all of us were enthralled, watching it from week to week, and then it was coming to an end, and lots of people were in crisis. Some of my neighbors were in crisis. What happens now? There's never going to be anything like that again. And you still hear this kind of noise out there that it was the best. Oh, the Game of Thrones has been the best show on television for a long time. But I'm going to have my critique. I loved it too. But I suddenly had my critique of it. And I felt the adulation was a little over the top. Um, Reflecting perhaps a lack of acquaintance with some of the truly great works of literature. Um, and so I started thinking about, I mean, especially, the greatest of all time. And let's be serious, it was a great show, but the great, So I started thinking about the Mahabharata and quickly realized nobody has a clue in the Western world. Ordinary people don't know much about it, if they know anything at all. And so I started thinking about how to make it that it would be accessible to people interested in a new story,
Mm-hmm.
interested in literature, and but who know nothing about Indian history, Indian culture, who are not familiar with the story from a cultural background. So that was my impulse on how to orient
Mm-hmm.
the podcast. And hopefully, it's hard. It's hard to keep it so that you're not taking for granted the cultural background, the rich cultural background. People that listeners know all this, and I don't know how successful I've been in walking that line, really.
Well, I think as you said in the episode, there's about 1 billion of you out there who might have some familiarity with this, but for the
Yeah.
remaining podcast listeners, we're gonna start at the beginning here. Um, yeah, there's a lot of follow ups there. I'm going to refrain from going too deep down the Game of Thrones comparative route
Right.
here. I don't want to turn this into the Game of Thrones versus Mahābhārata podcast episode, but it is interesting to think about that as a modern frame that could kind of bring or hook new readers, new viewers in. I'm sure in the classroom it can be kind of a useful tool to get people thinking about maybe these epics, when we'll talk about that term, kind of in a new and in a fresh way, so the podcast, though, you set out and you said we're going to retell and relive the entire Mahābhārata. Mahābhārata is a very, very big text, is it not?
It's pretty long, yeah.
How big is it?
It's 18 volumes, so 100,000 verses written in 18 volumes. So this is its right back here.
Okay, so for those watching on
Uh,
YouTube, you see this.
oh,
If you're listening, Arti's got her bookshelf behind her, and an entire row of her shelf is that those are the 18
those are the
volumes.
18 volumes with commentary and notes, but still a very long piece of work. So it's, I say in the first episode that it would, if you were to read it cover to cover, it would take easily 6 months to a year of your life, and it's dense. It's just convoluted, windy, and so forth. So not an easy text to read. So not an easy text to read even for people who have some concept of what it is, what the primary story is.
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit. How did you become an expert and scholar on the Mahabharata? How did you become a professor in the study of religion and Hinduism? Take us back a little bit and tell us a little bit about your training and your background.
So I did my undergraduate work in English and in history. So I have those interests to begin with.
And where
Most of
where
that
was
work,
where was that?
this was in the University of Calgary in Alberta, in the western part of Canada. So I did my undergraduate work there. Um, but most of the literature that I was reading, most of the history that I was reading was European. Um, Pretty well all of it. And I was interested, I wanted to do something outside of the European sphere. And really, the only place to do any study of something non-Eurocentric was in the religion department, and you could bring a whole level of critique to that as well. So I started doing religious studies, and through religious studies, I discovered. I mean, I obviously knew these texts culturally. I'd grown up. I'm South Asian. I've grown up in the culture, so I knew these texts culturally, but I wasn't acquainted with them as a scholar. So I started looking first at the Rāmāyaṇa, which is 7 volumes, hence more accessible. So I did that for my master's work, and then looking for a PhD project. The obvious thing was the Mahābhārata. For that, I went to McGill University in Montreal, and uh, so that's really where well, these texts are so vast and so rich, you really can spend the bulk of a lifetime studying them. They're not as widely studied as the European classics, so there's lots of room for discussion there and debate. So that's basically what I've been doing for going on 25 years now.
It's overwhelming for me to think about the Ramayana as a MA level degree course, and then you graduate to move to the more lengthy, sort of advanced Mahabharata, 18 parvan, over 100,000 shlokas. For comparison, the text that I'm working on still slowly for my dissertation is this 15th century yoga text from South India, and it's 290 verses,
Right.
in 5 chapters. And
Right.
it's taking me so long to kind of get through this project, and yet in comparison it's just a little, crumb, right, of the vastness of these types of works, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So that must be challenging and overwhelming uh, to try to do a type of project. How do you kind of find your way in to a text like the Mahabharata? You have to find specific questions and themes that you want to kind of pursue within this vast literary jungle.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, it is overwhelming even after 25 some years of doing it, because well, let's just talk about the Mahabharata to begin with. You read 1 volume, you're halfway through because the stories are so complex and so involved and have so many layers and layers of nuances that by the time you start volume 1, by the time you get to the end, you've forgotten the beginning. By the time you're in volume 3, I mean, there's so much there that you need to carry with you as you move through the text. And but volume 11, it's a lot. How do you manage it? I mean, I can't claim that anybody. There are some scholars who are just extraordinary in doing this, but you know so as most of us, what we do is you find a theme, you try to you try to you try to trace it through the text or through certain sections of the text. So in my doctoral work and in my early work, I was focused on themes of gender, and there's so much there to do. So I can't even claim to have really contributed more than a few drops to that ocean. And now I'm more concerned with other questions, and they're endless questions. Like you said, you can spend a lifetime on a text for 300 verses, and you can spend lifetimes on what these texts are. There's so much to study, and and it's such a joy, really. It's a universe of its own. It's so rewarding in terms of not only the movement of the narrative, but also in terms of the philosophical reflection, in terms of the moral concerns. Richly stimulating in so many ways.
Yeah, and hopefully we can get a little bit deeper into some of those themes that have animated your work, and that you'll be sharing with us in the upcoming online course. I wanted to ask you just about this term, the epics. Oftentimes Mahābhārata and Rāmāyaṇa are classified or categorized as epics. They're often compared to, the Western so-called epics, the Odyssey and the Iliad. What do you make of just this comparison and using that term? Do you find it helpful? Is it useful in your work, in your teaching? Does it make sense to compare the Mahābhārata and Rāmāyaṇa, these texts from a vastly different culture and civilization, of ancient India, to these Western, European epics?
I mean, that's a great question. So it's well known that Indian aesthetics does not have a category called epic. So this is a Western import into the study of Indian literature. Indian aesthetic categories are so in Indian terms, the Mahabharata and the Rāmāyaṇa are itihasa and kavya respectively, or and also include or draw upon other genres. That said, I do find the term epic to be useful. There's lots to critique about using it uncritically. So in a lot of the work of the 19th century, even early part of the 20th century, the category of epic was being applied in the sort of fashion where it was difficult, or at least in some of the scholarship, scholars had difficulty seeing the text. You're so busy applying the rubric of epic and then trying to read these texts through that prism that a lot of the material of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana just didn't make sense to Western scholars. So that was a problematic practice. I call it something like trying to stuff an elephant into the skin of a giraffe, right? The Mahabharata, for certain, is, something of the heft of an elephant. And what Western scholars are trying to do is try and make it look like a giraffe. So you're kind of surgically excising the fat of the Mahabharata and trying to make it look lean and athletic, warrior-like, as the Iliad might be considered.
Are there certain, within the Western tradition, are there certain requirements that classify something as an epic?
Right. So an epic is generally associated with a narrative about warriors doing extraordinary things in relation to gods, etc. So it very much around a warrior ethos. And to that point, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana certainly have reflect some element of a warrior culture. So on that point, it seems fair to bring the notion of epic into conversation with what these texts are. That's but beyond that, these texts are much more. So, so the way I would describe it now to my students is, well, the term epic is as a place to begin the conversation about what these texts are, and it makes it so that students coming into studying them have something to relate to. Okay, so I know who Achilles is. Well, now I can think of Arjuna, but okay, Achilles and Arjuna, that comparison works for a little while, but at some point it doesn't, and it becomes the Indian material, or suddenly the Mahabharata goes off or has bigger concerns than the Iliad does, arguably in any case. If you're an Iliad scholar listening to me, sorry about that. But certainly I would say the Mahabharata, the Ramayana have a very serious didactic purpose, aims, and so the comparison works for a little while. I think is useful for a little while, and at some point, you need to understand that they only work as epics if the term is much more elastic than we're used to thinking of it, or at least that 19th century scholars were used to thinking of it.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I like that as a way in. It's something we're familiar with, and then we can challenge it. Then we can, we can expand and problematize, beyond that. Go ahead.
No, absolutely, because the Mahabharata is concerned. Well, just speaking of the Mahabharata now. It's concerned. Oh, it's certainly reflecting. It's got the central narrative is about heroes and heroic culture, and the events of the story are very concerned with all of that. But on the other hand, it's also concerned with the big questions. The Mahabharata takes as its aim everything that is in human experience. It wants to reflect on all of that, which it seems to me goes a little bit beyond, the mandate, if there is one, of what an epic does. Certainly, epics do reflect on big questions, but not. I would say beyond, not to the extent that the Mahabharata wants to do.
Yeah, sometimes you hear a saying. I'm kind of paraphrasing. I'm curious where this comes from, actually, but maybe this is a line in the text that says, everything under the sun is in the Mahabharata, and if it's not in the Mahabharata, it doesn't exist. Something
to that effect. Yes,
Yeah.
That's a statement that comes up early in the text.
Okay.
What you find here, you'll find elsewhere. What you don't find, what you find here about dharma, artha, kam, and moksha, you'll find elsewhere. What you don't find here, you're not going to find anywhere else in the world. Okay, so it's that's the kind of grand statement the Mahabharata loves. But on the other hand, there's a fair bit to it. I mean, the Mahabharata does touch on all kinds of crazy stuff. Coming up in my podcast in the next few episodes, I'm going to be talking about human sacrifice and men giving birth to babies, etc. So there's a lot of crazy stuff there.
How far into the text are you in your podcast right now?
I'm only on. I'm coming up on episode 63. I've had a bit of a gap here on account of a lot of other things going on, but I'm on episode 63, which is about 30-40% into book 3. So I've got a long way to go.
Long way to go, but you've covered some good ground though already.
Well, yeah, once again, it's book 3 out of 18. So the road ahead is longer than the road behind.
Yes. So, especially for those who maybe you've heard of the Mahabharata, maybe you haven't, maybe you've studied it in detail, maybe not, but can you give us just kind of a general introduction and kind of overview? Obviously, this is such a huge text as we're talking about. There's so many themes and complex issues, but what's sort of a general summary and kind of the main issues and themes, that one would encounter in the Mahabharata?
Well, at its center, as you certainly know, and many people will know, at its center, it's the story of one family fighting it out for an ancestral kingdom. So you've got the two sets of cousins, the Pandavas, the five brothers, with their common wife, Draupadi. And then you've got on the other side their 100 cousins led by Duryodhana. And so there's a conflict around, so the Pandavas are, quote unquote, the virtuous. The nobody in the Mahabharata is perfect,
Mm.
but on the whole, they are understood. Then the text represents them as the more virtuous. The Kauravas are more ambitious, concerned with retaining the empire. So at the heart, that's the conflict, and it's going to work its way through all kinds of dynamics until they're going to come to a point of no return in a war. The war will involves 18 million people, will take 18 days to fight, and at the end of it, pretty well, everybody will be dead. Something like perhaps 10 to 11 named people will be alive, and there'll be random others whose names we don't know, who just ran away from the battlefield in the last few days. But 11 named characters will remain alive of the combatants in the war. And then there'll be a lengthy reflection after that on the bigger questions of life, right? You've lost all your children. How do you deal with loss? How do you deal with grief? How do you deal with suffering? How do you deal with guilt? If you're the person who instigated the war or who could have stopped it but didn't, and now you have to live with, well, it's because of me or my ambition or what have you, that all of this has come about. How do you deal with that? How do you continue in the world knowing everybody you loved is dead, is gone? How do you continue in the world? What's the place of violence? What's the appropriate place of violence? What's the appropriate place for human endeavor? Do we have any control over our existence and our experience at all? Or is it that the gods control us? Is it, to what extent do we contribute to what we experience in our lives? And to what extent are we subject to the whims of the world, to what happens to us? So these are some of these are universal questions, basic foundational questions for all beings, all human beings. And so the Mahabharata, on the one hand, is this very intense narrative. On the other hand, it's a reflection as well on all of these bigger questions on how to be in the world when this is a place of inevitable loss, inevitable grief, suffering. How to find happiness in the world when these are some of the inevitable conditions of life.
So the Mahabharata deals with these sort of, in some ways, universal human experiences, human psychology, the nature of the human condition, in kind of one of the most intense human conflicts possible, that of war. So on the one hand, it's sort of universal and transcends time and place and culture. On the other hand, it's very specific to the Indian cultural, bedrock and civilization. It comes out of a particular history and cultural context. What can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Mahabharata as a text? I know this is a big question. It's a debated question about its origin, its history, its authorship, its dating. It's a question that today has become very politicized for various reasons in India because of the way in which the Mahabharata is received as a sacred text, as a scripture. What can you tell us about kind of what you and other Mahabharata scholars, what's sort of a general consensus, or where the issues of debate, about the Mahabharata's past?
I mean, this is, as you say, this is a very big question. So let's talk about dates. So traditional Indian understanding might be that the Mahabharata is based on real events that occurred, in the distant past, and there are certainly there's a reams of literature on trying to date events in the Mahabharata based on astronomical data and what have you. I can't really speak to that. It's but what I in scholarly terms, we understand the Mahabharata to the consensus is probably composed around the turn of the millennium, perhaps about 2,000 years ago. The scholarly consensus is that it probably is engaging, or it seems to certainly be engaging in its reflections and in its stories, a context in which there's a fair bit of turbulence, cultural, political turbulence in this period of history, with the rise of the Mauryas, with Emperor Ashoka, with the rise of Buddhism, Jainism, and some of these other traditions, with the competition among these traditions for resources and for royal patronage. And the Mahabharata is in conversation with Tacit or otherwise, in conversation with these other traditions, in dialogue with these traditions, and is also responding to some of their core precepts and some of their contentions. So scholarship generally understands the Mahabharata to have one way or the other, either composed in as one giant project, or as or in terms of composed in one giant project, or else as a process of compiling material that was already pre-existed in oral culture and assembled at this time, around maybe the turn of that about 2,000 years ago, maybe 2,300 years ago, maybe a little less, depending on who you read, but somewhere around there. I don't think this is hugely contestable in scholarship, that it is certainly concerned with new ideas emerging from the Upanishads, for example, and new ideas that are being developed in Jainism and Buddhism, etc. You can see that debate happening, and so I think that there are good grounds for seeing it as a product of this period of history.
Was the Mahabharata, was it considered originally an oral, or sometimes called a bardic tradition, where these stories that were recited orally, and then moving, adapting, changing, and then at some point believed to have been written down and codified in written Sanskrit?
It depends who you read. Depends who you read. So there are
Mhm.
different. There are some scholars who say, well, it was a long-standing oral tradition, and there's no doubt that some element of the Mahabharata certainly incorporates stories, traditions that were out there in oral culture. So, the Mahabharata, as you certainly know, and lots of people will know, not only tells one primary tale of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, but also has literally thousands of other stories incorporated into it. And these stories are probably alive and well known in oral culture, so they get drawn into or assimilated into the larger text. Was it originally an oral? Was it an oral tradition that then becomes um, uh, composed in with some formality as a text? Um, Depending on who you read, there's certainly, for example, one of the leading scholars of the Mahabharata, Al
Mhm.
argues that, well, it was composed as a written work, um, perhaps over a generation, by a team of scholars. Maybe not, depending on, again, who you read, but um, I think the jury's out on that one. My own, certainly my own understanding of it is that um, and as we have it, as we receive it, it is um, a coherent composition.
Mm.
Um, Depending on, and then it's a question of what are the historical reasons for why it came about now under the auspices of whose patronage, etc. What are the historical conditions? Those are things that there's a lot of debate about.
Yeah. And with, I mean, such a vast text, 100,000 shlokas, a text that, spanned all across the subcontinent and, of course, beyond the Indian subcontinent, the Mahabharata being a text that traveled throughout Asia, you know, Southeast Asia, East Asia, taking on new forms, adapting, taking on different cultural elements
Yes.
in other regions like Bali and um, when one approaches the Mahabharata today and even like goes to read a translation of the Mahabharata in English or in French or another language, which version of the Mahabharata are they reading? I always like to ask this question of people because it's sort of assumed that there's just this single text, but with a text like the Mahabharata that is so complex, so vast, so many different manuscripts.
Yeah.
There was this critical edition, right? That this huge project and undertaking that was done by the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, carried out over decades, I believe, in the like mid 1900s.
Yes.
Um, does that tend to be the sort of gold standard today that most of the translations are based on, or do you have any thoughts about that edition? I know there were sort of a series of controversies surrounding the institute and the edition because of the way that work was perceived by some in India. But do you have any thoughts about any of that?
Yeah. So I do. There are, as you say, many Mahabharata traditions, many versions of the Mahabharata in different languages and different cultures, widely disparate. And there are also many Sanskrit traditions of the Mahabharata. And the critical edition project has come under a bit of criticism. It did come under some criticism, and there are still scholars today who say, well, uh, who don't agree with, or certainly all of it. My Speaking for myself, my interest is I approach it from a literary angle. I'm interested in historical questions, but historical questions from a sociological angle. So if there are different um, if there are interpolations into the text, what are the conditions that would have given rise to these interpolations? What do they tell us about the people who are interested in interpreting a particular passage in this way rather than that way? So those are the sort of questions that I would have. But I'm interested in it as literature, and I work with the critical edition. I think it's a marvelous, it's an extraordinary feat of accomplishment. And no, probably no work is perfect, and the critical edition probably isn't perfect as well. But I think it's a very, certainly some scholars have said it's as close to a prototype as we're ever going to get. And it doesn't need to be, or it doesn't need to have been the original or even
Right.
close to the original. But I think it's that's certainly the version that I work with. That's the version that's been translated through the University of Chicago Press, still in progress.
Mm-hmm.
So I just even working with that's the work of a lifetime. And then there are other versions of it, other recensions that scholars work on, and that's fine as well. But there's more than enough to go on just with the critical edition. And there are some questions that can only be answered, but if you're asking historical critical questions, then you need to look at, well, where did this passage come from, etc. And so forth. Those aren't the questions that I'm asking. The questions I'm interested in are about the crafting of community, the development of ideas, and so forth. And I think there's lots to go on just with the critical edition. So that's, yeah.
Okay, great. So you mentioned, in your doctoral work, you found the theme of gender and the role and agency of women in the Mahabharata. I know you've written a lot about this, at least 2 books.
No, I've got one book on gender. I have some articles.
Okay.
My current work is, very different nature.
Okay, so the book I wanted to discuss is titled "Women as Fire," or "Woman as Fire, Woman as Sage: Sexual Ideology in the Mahabharata." Did this grow out of your PhD thesis?
It did, yeah.
This book, can you tell us a little
So,
bit about it?
yeah, so my interest there was emerged from anybody who's read the text or has any exposure to it. Well, notes that there's a considerable discrepancy between what the text says about women and what should be their role in didactic terms, what is the nature of women, and so forth, what the text says about women, and the characters of women as they emerge in the narrative. There's considerable discrepancy. Women are supposed to be, quiet and demure and obedient and compliant and self-effacing, etc. Well, I mean, the women of the Mahabharata just are not that. And so, like many people, I was interested in that tension. So I started looking at that, and then I approached that question from various angles. Some of them, and ultimately I was concerned with what is the construction, how does the Mahabharata construct gender? And I found through my study that there's really no generalization that we can make about it. So if the text is polyvocal, it speaks at multiple levels. So if you're on the one hand, it's concerned with goals of ultimacy. So if it's speaking at that level, the understanding of gender is very different from if it's speaking at a more pedestrian, a worldly level about how society should function and so forth. And then the roles, the understanding of gender, the construction of women's identity is much more conservative and viewed very differently. So I was intrigued by that, and that's really what I do in that book. My current work is a long way away from that. So now, at this point, I'm more interested in comparative work. So the manuscript I'm working on now, it's pretty well complete. Hopefully all the I's dotted and so forth by the end of the year. But at this point, I'm comparing the Rāmāyaṇa and the Mahābhārata, these two sort of behemoths of Sanskrit literature. And I'm concerned with the architecture of the two books. So I'm looking at core philosophical presuppositions, because one of the assumptions about both of these texts is that they represent a common genre. We call them epics, the Hindu epics, we say, and we say they seem to have that they have a common purpose, a common idea about dharma. They seem to have a common message, didactically, philosophically, politically, and so forth. I don't think so from my work. And so in what I'm doing currently is looking at the two texts in relation to each other and contending that they're actually very different works.
So in your first book, The Woman as Fire, Woman as Sage, is there a particular female character or even story that maybe you could share with us that was important for thinking about that work? You kind of mentioned that there are specific ideals for women in theory in the Mahābhārata, but that then kind of in reality on the pages sort of different things transpire that challenge those notions, or share with us maybe something.
Well, there's so much there, and certainly if you think of the main women characters in the Mahābhārata, none of them really fit into a stereotype of any sort. Draupadi is an enigma at all times. On the one hand, she seems to be, and she even gives these lengthy speeches about a woman's duty and how a woman should be self-effacing in front of her husband and so forth. On the other hand, she certainly isn't self-effacing, and she's quite demanding and quite noisy in making her objections known. So Draupadi is like that. Satyavati certainly is a force in terms of directing the Bharata dynasty. Kunti, all of these women, though the construction of womanhood is supposed to be that they're secondary characters as supporters or helpmates of men, they're really running the show either overtly or behind the scenes. Kunti is basically she's a single mother of these five men that she's brought up, and so she's quite a powerful figure, even if not materially so. So there's a lot there. I'll give two examples though. So my concern, one of the things that I was intrigued with in that text, which is where the title came from, Woman as Fire, Woman as Sage. On the one hand, you have the understanding of a woman as really a wise figure, as somebody, self-possessed, of dignity, of great compassion and insight and knowledge. And on the other hand, there are just like grossly misogynist passages where a woman is like fire, she's gonna burn you, she's an untrustworthy snake, she's like the sharp edge of a razor, watch out for women. This is the sort of common language you can find in many traditions, or pretty well most
Are those lines about women in general, or are they targeted at specific characters?
No, there are misogynist passages that just sort of throw this out there. Women are like this,
Yeah.
and then we can contextualize them to say who's talking here and what's the context, etc. But they're misogynist passages common in many traditions. But when you look at specific women, it's a different story altogether. So the Mahabharata ideology on women is pretty. Again, what I established in that book is the Mahabharata speaks at multiple levels. If you're talking about women at this pedestrian, worldly level, it's very conservative. If you're talking about at a more enlightened level, at a higher level, it's extraordinarily what we might call progressive. Simultaneously. And so I look at some of these. Factors in that book.
So Arti, we have a question that came in actually from our online community.
Yes.
This is a question from our teaching assistant, Sabi Lal, who you'll be meeting soon. And
yes.
she wants to know, do you have an earliest memory of the Mahābhārata? Can you recall what perhaps your earliest memory of the text is?
I don't think I can. It's an interesting question. The great scholar A.K. Rāmānujan says nobody. If you grew up in India, as I did my early years, he says no Hindu hears the Mahabharata for the first time. So it's in the air, it's in the water, it's just, it's part of your bloodstream, and it's just always been there. I don't think I do. I didn't know the story until I started studying it, and of course there are the television phenomena,
sure,
etc.
I
knew it through the Gita, maybe.
I wanted to ask you about that, actually, the television series. Was that in the 80s? And did
90s.
The 90s. Did that have any impact on you?
Did it have any impact on? I was studying the text at the time, so I didn't want to watch it. So I don't want to be influenced. I didn't get it muddled in my head.
Yeah.
I did eventually watch it. It's coming from a very particular perspective where it's a sacred text speaking to concerns of piety and so forth. So that's obviously not how we approach it as scholars. But it had the effect of reviving it for a generation. So there was a real likelihood that by the time you get to that we got to that generation, or maybe I'm part of that generation, I don't know. a lot of these old texts would have been forgotten because we're all growing up in a much more with a different type of education, or more secular, quote unquote, education and so forth. But it had the effect of, at the very least, generating curiosity and interest among at that time, Indians about and then reviving interest in scholarship and study of these texts.
Yeah, and
So
still today, I mean, whenever I've traveled in India and I stay at a hotel and you turn on the television, it's
yes,
sort of like daytime television, what what we think of as soap operas here,
yeah.
in American
But
culture.
more so because beyond that, because they're watching the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the acts of piety.
Yes.
So it's like for a lot of people, it's like going to the temple
Yeah.
and engaging in some manner of uh, ritual contemplation. So it's
Sure.
you're
And
you're
there's
getting
Sanskrit
nourished.
prayers that are layered throughout it, and
Yes.
it's almost
So
it's almost the act of puja on the
yes,
television for many
abs-
Hindus, right?
yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's beyond just a soap opera, though it certainly does have that quality.
Yeah.
It's about piety.
Yeah. So you mentioned you quoted Ramanujan, this idea that it's sort of these epics, both Ramayana and Mahabharata, they're sort of in the water,
Yeah.
for Indians. What Tell me a little bit more just about how these stories have impacted Indian culture, kind of throughout history,
Yeah.
but today as well. As you were saying, you couldn't recall a specific memory, but it's just always sort of there. And I think that's
Yeah.
important to think about when we talk about these themes, these women, these characters. We'll get to a little bit about yoga here soon, but tell us a little bit about, how these texts have impacted the culture.
The great literary critic Northrop Frye um, has a mixed comment about Western civilization. And he says you can't really understand Western civilization if you don't know the Bible. And by that, of course, he means the Christian version of the Bible with its Old Testament. You don't know Bible stories, you don't understand. You have a very shallow understanding of Western civilization. Same thing can be said for um, South Asia, maybe even a good chunk of Southeast Asia, but certainly South Asia, if you don't know the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. The Ramayana and the Mahabharata inform every aspect of cultural production in South Asia. So you dance, music, history, philosophy, visual art, performing arts. Um, you can't politics. Think about politics today, politics in the past, history. Kings in the past, for example, consciously appropriated um, appropriated images of kingship, for example, notions from these texts. Um, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana speak to literally every aspect of that, how is or kinship relations. So growing up in India, you don't need to say, "Well, be a good brother to your siblings," or etc. Be like Ram, be a good wife, be Sita,
Mhm.
right? You don't need to explain what that means. Everybody already knows, already always knows what are the reference there. So they have extraordinary impact. They continue to have extra. I mean, if we've known anything about the history of India for the last 30, 40, 50 years, um, partly with the help of these television revivals, um, they're the the characters of these texts, the stories of these texts have been mobilized, the ideas of these texts have been mobilized and put to modern use, modern political use, social use, and so forth. So I don't think you can overstate the impact of these texts for South Asian cultures.
Mm. All right. Now I'm tempted to ask you.
As much in the diaspora, I should say, not
Yeah.
just in,
Yeah.
us.
What without going into too much here, because we'll get into this as well in the course, but what can we say about the role of yoga within the Mahabharata? Of course, there's the Bhagavad Gita, which we actually haven't really even discussed.
Right.
A very important episode within the Mahabharata,
Yeah.
and I think actually probably most listeners would be most familiar with the Mahabharata through their study of the Gita,
Yes.
becoming familiar with the basic frame story of the Pandavas and the Kauravas in the Mahabharata through the lens of the Gita. So I guess so we know the yoga of the Gita, but yeah, tell me a little bit about how you kind of see yoga and yogis within the Mahabharata, kind of broadly.
Well, yoga in the Mahabharata is clearly not the yoga of Lululemon and your little mats that you carry into the studio. Yoga is a very serious a spiritual, a religious spiritual affair in terms of it's about mastery. It's about self mastery. So it's the yoga of the Mahabharata is let's put it this way: the Gita speaks of how to become the sthit prajna, the one established in wisdom. Mahabharata, uh, yoga in the Mahabharata is geared toward um, achieving mastery of oneself, achieving control of one's emotions, control of one's mind. And then take it in and then to put to different purposes if you want to. So there are so many things that we can say about yoga, but essentially, its primary uh, criterion is self-discipline, self-discipline of every sort. So of any sort is a yogic practice. So discipline in terms of how we conduct ourselves morally, walk morally through the world, how of the things that we say, the things that we think, discipline in terms of our personal habits of, eating, drinking, so forth. So it's a habit of self-discipline, sex, our relationships, our interaction with other people, and through self-discipline, one gains control of oneself, one gains control of one's mind, and then and that self-control has brings with it calmness, stability, centeredness, equanimity. Equanimity is one of the key goals of yogic practice in the Mahabharata. So I mean, you can see that right from the Gita, and yoga then is can be put to higher ends, higher goals, or to walking better, being being more centered, being more at calm and at peace within the world itself. So that was a long-winded way of saying that what is understood as yoga, certainly not to yogic study students perhaps, but out in the wider world, is not what is understood, is only one tiny subset of what is yoga in the Mahabharata, which is a much bigger affair, and it's about gaining gaining control of oneself, and particularly one's mind. So the Gita, for example, as you very well know, uses numerous metaphors to get this point across, right? So it's the candle in the wind, the flame in the wind. You want to be able to limit the turbulence in your mind so that you can keep the flame steady at the center. It's about your mind being riven apart by your desires, the wild horses of your desires. So what you want to do is control it so that you direct where your mind goes, rather than your desires taking in every direction. It's the little the ship in the water in turbulent waters. You want to calm those waters so that to steady the ship, which is your mind, and so forth. So yoga is in the Mahabharata is about self-mastery. It's about equanimity. It's about this kind of higher end purpose. And physical mastery is only one step, the first step even toward that.
Yeah, and I think because of the dating of this text, as we've talked about, maybe roughly 2,000 years ago, I would argue, we do get some of the earliest evidence of yoga as a spiritual or soteriological discipline throughout the Mahabharata, including the Gita, but also elsewhere. So that will be exciting to kind of read some of those passages and areas of the text, maybe outside of the Gita too, where yoga and asceticism and these qualities of self-cultivation kind of appear. So tell us a little bit about the course coming up. It's going to be a 6-week online course. As we've been describing, the Mahabharata is so vast, we're obviously not going to be able to read sort of 100,000 verses in 6 weeks. So how have you structured the course, and what can students expect who will be joining us?
So 6 weeks is not a lot that's going to, I was thinking about that, 2 hours a week for 6 weeks adds up to, no, not 2 hours a week, sorry.
Three hours a week, two
adds up
live
to,
sessions.
Adds up to 18 hours, which for the Mahabharata is a very special number.
Hey, there you go.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's not a lot that can happen in a space of that time. So to begin with, we're going to talk about the narrative. We're going to talk about the central story. We're going to talk about the layers of that story, the human levels, the divine levels, the ways in which the gods are involved in acting through the human story. So to begin with, we'll get a handle on that, and it's a pretty crazy story, a lot of fun. So we'll be doing some of that, and then we'll be looking at some of the big concerns emerging from the Mahabharata. So taking a cue from the Gita, for example. So Arjuna poised on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Okay, and the big debate about should I not engage in violence, and violence against my family? What does that mean? Isn't it evil to engage in violence, to kill your family, etc.? So it's taking up the question of violence, of the propriety, the morality of violence versus non-violence, or the reverse, non-violence versus violence, and what does the Mahabharata want to do with that? So we've got numerous traditions now that are very concerned about non-violence, ahimsa, etc. These are concepts that are in the air at this historical period. How does the Mahabharata deal with it? It's a text that represents extraordinary violence, right? 18 million people are going to die in horrid, gory ways. But at the same time, it claims to be a text of shanti, of tranquility, of peace, of serenity, wants to bring you to serenity. So how should we think about the notion of violence, the propriety of violence? That's one. So that's one point we'll look at. I want to look at some of the really quirky characters, or the women characters in the text as well, because that's a lot of fun for me. So we'll probably look at some case examples, and we might talk about Draupadi, who's a figure of endless fascination, and a few others. So 1 week we'll look at that. I also want to look at the idea of God. So God and gods. How should we understand that? Who's Krishna? How should we think of Krishna? What does God do? What is the purpose of God? Is God essential? And what's the character of God? So these are some of those are some of the points that I want to look at in the second half of the course in this kind of workshop fashion, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to it. For those who are interested in getting to study with Arti, to read the Mahabharata, actually tell us, we're going to use a particular version of the text to make it accessible for everyone. So you don't need to know Sanskrit to take this course. It will be kind of accessible to anybody who's interested. Maybe say a word about the text.
So we're going to use an abridged translation of the text by John Smith. There's a Penguin version. I usually have one with me here, but I don't think I do currently. So it's still a fairly hefty a fairly hefty text. So we'll be using that abridged version. It's a pretty faithful translation of some of the most important scenes of the text, or at least of the dramatic scenes of the text, and which is basically all one can hope to do in a short period of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, the course is going to run live from October 3rd through November 11th. But if you're watching or listening to this after, then itihasa, it's done, as it were, and it's available for self-study. Everything's been recorded. So thank you so much, Arti. This was really a pleasure to get to chat with you. Thanks for making the time today. And
absolute pleasure.
And we really look forward to the course, and we hope that many of you will consider joining us for this deep immersion into the Mahabharata, one of India's and the world's great epic tales.
The story of everything.
All right. Thanks, Arti. We'll be in touch soon, and thanks as always to our viewers and our listeners. Please take care, and until next time.